What is up, everybody? Welcome to another edition of the Touchline Talk Show. There is a U.S. men's national team World Cup roster to discuss. I was in the press conference with Greg Berhalter until just a couple minutes ago. I had to dip out early to make sure I was prepared for this, but he had some really interesting things to say that I'm going to highlight when discussing this roster. That's going to be the first part of the show. We're going to talk all things U.S. men's national team World Cup roster, and then highlight some of the other developments of this week, primarily in Europe, some interesting things happening in La Liga, Carabao Cup today, and a potential sale of Liverpool. So all of that will be in segment 2. But we start with what we just got 2 hours ago, which is the 26-man squad for the U.S. men's national team for the World Cup. So I'm going to break this down position by position and sprinkle in some of the things Greg Berhalter just mentioned as I go through. Your goalkeepers: Ethan Horvath, Sean Johnson, Matt Turner. I'm going to go in alphabetical order with all of these. Greg Berhalter didn't go as far as to guarantee Matt Turner was the number one. It's also important to remember Matt Turner is coming off of an injury. But he did go as far as saying it would be fair to categorize it as leaning in the direction that Matt Turner is going to be the number one. To me, that means Matt Turner is going to be the number one unless something goes wrong. And when you look at these other two as opposed to Zach Steffen, I really like this decision by Berhalter because you can identify something specific with these two guys outside of just their goalkeeping abilities that I'm not sure you're getting with Zach Steffen. For Ethan Horvath, and Greg Berhalter mentioned this, in a situation where something unexpected happens and he's thrown into a game, he has proven, both for club and country, he is unfazed and you can count on him to be ready at a moment's notice, and he is not only going to be able to show up, he's going to be able to make big plays, like he has done for the U.S. men's national team in that Nations League final. And he also ended up, his situation last season at the club level. He has been thrown into some very high-stress situations and has done well. That is a valuable thing to have at the goalkeeper position in particular, where the plan is not to switch goalkeepers, obviously. You need somebody who you have faith in to be ready, especially as a backup, if something happens to Matt Turner. And Ethan Horvath has proven he is more than capable of and excels in those kind of situations. And then Sean Johnson, it's the leadership aspect and the consistency. He very rarely makes mistakes. He's just rock solid for NYCFC. He's been with this group. And also, this is an incredibly young group that is going for the U.S. Sean Johnson has seen a lot. He's just naturally a good leader. He has that kind of personality. And so he's going to help unify this team. He can provide sort of that veteran perspective that many of the players on the field aren't going to have because they're in their early 20s. So there's that valuable part of it as well. And you look at Zach Steffen, and what you're pointing out with Zach Steffen is the ability to play out of the back, right? What he can do with the ball at his feet. Sometimes that's been good recently, sometimes not so much. He's made plenty of noticeable mistakes, which is something I will continue to point out Matt Turner does not do. Those kind of mistakes that can cost you a World Cup game and can send you home. And he does have that high ceiling of when he's good, he's really good. I still like Turner better from a sort of best case scenario perspective because I really do believe Matt Turner is a world-class shot stopper for all of his other flaws. But you haven't seen good Zach Steffen in a couple of years now. Everything you're seeing about Zach Steffen is bad, whether it's injuries or mistakes he's making. And so when you have two other guys that are getting consistent playing time, that provide something additional, because that's the other part of the back end of this roster is you're probably not going to see the field very much. What can you bring? And Sean Johnson can bring a very, that veteran presence, that experience, the guy who can just fit in seamlessly and is going to be ready to be, certainly can perform if called upon. And you have that guy who's excelled in high pressure situations, Ethan Horvath. So it makes all the sense in the world to me this went the way it did. You don't have time to get Zach Steffen back into good form. And so it's unfortunate, considering the important role he played getting the U.S. here, but that's just not the situation you're in. So I do really like what Berhalter did at the goalkeeper position. On to defenders, and another one of maybe not a huge surprise because the rumors had started circulating over the past few days, but some interesting names in here nonetheless. Your defenders: Cameron Carter-Vickers, Serginho Dest, Aaron Long, Shaq Moore, Tim Ream, Jedi Robinson, Joe Scally, DeAndre Yedlin, Walker Zimmerman. Of course, missing from this list is Chris Richards, who just announced before this roster came out that he was going to be unavailable through injury. You have to think if Chris Richards is available, he makes this team. However, this is one of the really interesting things Greg Berhalter was talking about. Ahead of that September camp, Greg Berhalter said Tim Ream does not excel. I don't think these were exact words, but something to the effect of Tim Ream does not excel at the things we want our center backs to do. And at that moment, I went, there is no way Tim Ream is making this roster. Today, Greg Berhalter had a completely different tone, which was, I don't need to explain why Tim Ream is here. Tim Ream is playing really well in the best league in the world. And his last cap was September 2nd, 2021. But he's been around, it's not like you need to reintegrate him into the national team setup. He's been doing this for years as a regular contributor. And so the way I interpreted Berhalter's argument was basically, September I wasn't sold, which to a certain extent is fair, that Tim Ream was going to continue doing this. So at that point, it wasn't part of the conversation. But then he continued to play really well. And so all of a sudden, it becomes a much easier decision to put him on this team. I still have a hard time putting those two statements, 2 months apart together, which is why I think Chris Richards' injury ultimately changed this. But you're going to see one of the themes here is form. And to be fair to Greg Berhalter, he said that from the very beginning, and he has been true to his word in that sense, that guys have to be playing well because you don't have a camp to build up to this. You don't have, games. You have got to be ready to go when you land in Qatar because it's a few training sessions and then you're playing. The other thing he mentioned about Tim Ream was, and this I also do think has some validity, you're in a different situation at a World Cup than you are in CONCACAF qualifying. And when the margins are this thin at positions, I have no problem with that being part of the logic. Tim Ream goes up against this kind of competition day in and day out in the Premier League. And every day in training against, Alexander Mitrovic and the other Fulham attackers. Maybe he's not best suited to play, where you're trying to hold the ball high up the field. The other team is giving you the ball because they're less talented than you are. And they're trying to hit you on the counter. That's not Tim Ream's strength. When you can be more of the counter-attacking team and play something closer to the style Fulham does, it makes more sense. And I've said this about the team overall, and it applies to Tim Ream too. I believe this group is much better situated in a World Cup to maximize their potential than they are in CONCACAF qualifying. CONCACAF qualifying is not how to get the best out of these players. They are not built, and it's because of their talents and the way and what they're used to playing, and the way they're used to playing, because most of them play in Europe at this point. They're not built to get kicked around. They are built to go play against the best teams in the world. And so that's what you're going to get to do, and Tim Ream is going to help you do that. So take all of that as you will. I wanted to mention both extremes that Berhalter has used in the past couple months when talking about Tim Ream. The other absence here is Sam Vines. So I'm assuming Joe Scally is your other left back. I was very much on the Sam Vines should be the second left back. You need two left-footed left backs out there. Obviously, Greg Berhalter didn't have that choice because of Sam Vines' injury, so Joe Scally gets that nod. You bring 3 right backs. Reggie Cannon is the one who ultimately gets left off of this roster because it's Shaq Moore, it's DeAndre Yedlin, of course, Serginho Dest. And then your other 3 center backs are exactly who you would expect them to be. So all of a sudden, when you find yourself choosing between Eric Palmer-Brown, Mark McKenzie, and Tim Ream, it's much easier to go out there and say, of course, it was going to be Tim Ream. That is part of the discussion here. On to the midfield. Brendan Aronson, Kellen Acosta, Tyler Adams, Luca De La Torre, Weston McKennie, Yunus Musa, Christian Roldan. No shockers. Luca De La Torre, it's good news that he was able to make this team and should be okay with his injury. He is an important piece of this puzzle for the reasons I laid out when you saw what happened without Yunus Musa, because he is the closest thing they have to Yunus Musa. That ball-carrying midfielder to connect the back to the front without having to pass. Is he what you need to be able to do that against England? Maybe not. That's why Yunus Musa is such an important piece to this team. But from having a guy who can replicate that, having 2 of them, Luca De La Torre is incredibly important, and he was really, really good during qualifying. So it's great to see him be able to get on this roster. And then the last name, probably, if you will, is Christian Roldan. I've been on Christian Roldan's side the entire time on this. He does so many things well that just don't show up in the box score, but he also can contribute. It's not like he's just defensive minded, right? He's not Tyler Adams. And you can throw him on the wing if you need to. He can play just about everywhere. And so what I ultimately love about this midfield, with Christian Roldan in there, is the diversity that you have. Brendan Aronson's listed in here. I don't think you should read too much into that. Greg Berhalter said, look, we can use him as a midfielder. We can use him as a winger. We're a little bit light in the midfield. I think he's going to play both positions at some point, depending on the situation. But you have, high-pressing, attack-minded, whether it's as a 10 or a winger, guy who creates chaos. You have Kellen Acosta, who gives you some defensive cover, a little bit of the box-to-box ability, and terrific free kicks. He just scored one in the MLS Cup. Tyler Adams, of course, one of the most important players on this team. Your 6, your destroyer, have to have one of those. Just talked about Luca De La Torre, and Yunus Musa falls into that category. I love the balance of that 3 that you expect to start in midfield. Weston McKennie, the technical ability, the box-to-box, the aerial ability, all of kind of the stuff that you don't get from Yunus Musa and you don't get from Tyler Adams. Weston McKennie gives you some of that. And then Christian Roldan gives you, again, some of that technical ability, some creativity, that if there's one criticism of this midfield, it's that for me. You don't have, and this is where I would have given Jordi Mihailovic much more consideration for this very reason. And I am not saying Christian Roldan is Jordi Mihailovic, but Christian Roldan has a little bit of that in him. There have been times where he's played as a midfielder higher up the field, helping in the attack, things like that. He's played on a wing. He can give you something a little bit different. So you've got just about every kind of midfielder outside of a prototypical 10, because I don't view Brendan Aronson as a prototypical 10. But when a situation calls for it, you can kind of attack different ways. And I do really like that, and I really like the addition of Roldan now that he's healthy to this team for that reason. And then finally, the big one, and one of the more surprising ones, the attackers. Your 3. Well, I'll go through all of them, sorry. Jesus Ferreira, Jordan Morris, Christian Pulisic, Gio Reyna, Josh Sargent, Tim Weah, Haji Wright. So your three strikers, Jesus Ferreira, Josh Sargent, Haji Wright. No Jordan Pefok, no Ricardo Pepi. This was another point where Greg Berhalter is interesting that I want to take some time to sort of communicate what he just said. Couple parts of this. One, Greg Berhalter said if this was September and he was picking the roster, Jordan Pefok would have been something close to a lock. And between September and now, Haji Wright has been in better form, and that is absolutely valid. Jordan Pefok has not been lighting up the Bundesliga recently. He had that terrific start to the season. Yes, he's still playing consistently for Union Berlin, but, had that injury, hasn't really been the same since he got back. Not in the best form right now. I said Greg Berhalter was consistent on the form thing, and this is another example. It also goes to a point that I made that I didn't necessarily think was actually the case about that September roster. Where one of the things I said was, I have no issue with Berhalter saying I want the three guys that play a similar game and have a similar profile in this camp because we haven't seen Ricardo Pepi in a long time and I want to give him an opportunity. And what was the other thing Greg Berhalter said? We know exactly what we're getting out of Jordan Pefok. You didn't need Jordan Pefok in that camp. And so I think there was a slight overreaction to that in terms of everybody losing their minds that Jordan Pefok wasn't going to make the roster. And it's why it was important to mention that point, because Berhalter said that. He acknowledged part of that was getting Pepi back into a rhythm, getting him some confidence to give him an opportunity. And look what's happened. He's gone back to the Eredivisie and he's been really, really good. And so ultimately this came down to who is putting the ball in the back of the net for that third striker spot. And that's what everybody was asking for, right? And the other part of this is Haji Wright gives you a plan B. And that was my big thing. That's it. It's been made clear you need, especially in those two windows when there was no plan B because the three strikers did mostly the same thing, you need somebody when you have to go play direct. And Haji Wright can do those kind of things. He's much closer to Pefok. And so now you have a guy that fits Berhalter's mold in Jesus Ferreira. Whatever you think about him, he does the things Berhalter wants. And then you've got sort of your completely different style striker in Haji Wright. And then you have Josh Sargent, who is here because of his own form. And another thing Berhalter mentioned that I do, again, find value in, talking about setting this team up for the World Cup and the fact that this group of players is more equipped to play in a World Cup than in CONCACAF qualifying, is Josh Sargent sees the kind of guys that are going to be on this Wales team and on this England team consistently playing in England. Now, yes, he is not going up against the English center backs in the championship. But the physicality, the style of play, all of that kind of stuff, it matters in a World Cup. It's so different from CONCACAF. And so that gives him an added boost too, is he's used to what these games are going to feel like. And he's played in the Premier League. And now he's scoring goals again. He's got, tremendous amount of confidence, and he was supposed to be one of these guys. And he took the long way to get there, but he did end up on this roster, and it's hard to poke holes into why he ended up there. The other really, really interesting decision that seems to have kind of gotten glossed over. I didn't hear Greg Berhalter talk about this. Jordan Morris, no Paul Arriola. Paul Arriola has taken some criticism as just kind of one of those guys that always ends up on the roster and you're not entirely sure what he does. I would argue that is doing him a disservice considering what he contributed in qualifying. Again, not that he's playing all these minutes, not that he's scoring all of these goals, but he did have a really good season for FC Dallas. And he also just does all of the hard work. He's relentless, and there is absolutely a spot on this team for those kind of players. You also have one in Brendan Aronson. And so that's where you start having to make some tough decisions. And you have all your attacking players available for the first time in who knows how long, if ever. Pulisic, Reyna, Weah, Aronson, right? Seemed like at least one of them was always gone. And so those are 4 guys who were going to make this team, assuming they were healthy. Jesus Ferreira was going to make this team, assuming he was healthy. That is 5 attacking players. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah. But yeah. And okay, so Aronson's in the midfield, so technically you sort of have an extra one there. That's why I was getting confused, double checking my math. My apologies. So those are 5 guys you know you can use up in the top of the field. So then you start having to make some choices. You obviously need strikers. They were going to bring 3. That was just how this was going to work. So those are 2 more. And all of a sudden you have 1 spot left. And to me, I want that spot going to a guy that I believe can be a difference maker in a game, can give you a decisive moment. You have enough guys who are going to be able to do the pressing and all of the stuff that doesn't show up on the stat sheet. I want the guy who can go beat somebody one-on-one, who can burn a defense, and that is Jordan Morris. Jordan Morris is still one of the best wingers in MLS. No, he didn't reach the levels he once was at. He's, after this injury, but he is still a really, really, really good player. And I like his chances against the highest level of opposition of contributing to goals more than I do Paul Arriola's. And the fact that everybody is healthy means Brendan Aronson is probably going to play some of the role of relentless worker who comes off the bench. Now, maybe he starts all 3 games in the group stage. But at some point, you got to find a way to get, and this is always going to be the big question, right? Reyna, Pulisic, a striker, and those 3 midfielders, theoretically, are all going to start. And then you're talking about defenders and a goalkeeper. So unless Greg Berhalter is planning to do something different with that or start Aronson in midfield every single game, Aronson has the ability to be that guy off the bench, and I love him in that role, which makes Paul Arriola expendable. And again, when you're talking about sort of something different, Jordan Morris has pace to burn. Jordan Morris can get behind the defense and cause problems that way, stretch the field. That's not really what Gio Reyna and Christian Pulisic do. They're capable, but Jordan Morris gives you a different dimension when it comes to pace. So I like it from that aspect as well. I will go to bat for these Seattle Sounders guys making this roster. I really, really like Greg Berhalter's decisions there. And overall, the other point I want to make here, and I guess there are a couple, but feel however you want about Greg Berhalter. I am trying to point out the ways in which he has been consistent, because to his credit, he has said things and actually backed them up. I am still trying to figure out how I feel about the change in tone on Tim Ream. But other than that, right, he was saying things like, we need our strikers to put the ball in the net. Guys who are in good form are going to get on this roster. And what did he say in September? This is not the final roster. And you saw some significant changes, notable changes at least, to that team. And now I had reservations about where this was going, and a lot of those reservations have been calmed by the way Greg Berhalter actually put this roster together. I think it kind of got lost because it's so easy for a manager, a head coach to sit there in September and say the roster's not finalized, and everybody goes kind of, yeah, okay, sure, whatever you say, give those guys some hope. But the way he was talking about the strikers and what he said that Jordan Pefok would have been on this roster in September convinces me that the plan was always to bring somebody different, and that was one of my big issues with September. I came away from that thinking he's going to just bring all of these guys who fit into his system and not anything different. And here we go. We've got Tim Ream on this roster. We've got Haji Wright on this roster. Two different situations because I've expressed my thoughts on and hesitations about the whole Tim Ream thing. But to me, this is the kind of roster I always wanted. Guys who give you something different, who are versatile, who give you a diverse way to approach the game. That you're not locked in if plan A, the high pressing, controlling the ball through the press, getting the ball to your wingers. If all of that doesn't work, like it didn't against Japan, all of a sudden you can bring on Haji Wright in the 60th minute. You can bring on Brendan Aronson to try and improve the press. You can bring on Christian Roldan. You have these different kind of options now. And the second part of this, that is the biggest takeaway, the most important reality of this roster. Injuries were going to be inevitable because players were going to get hurt in late October, early November, that were going to miss this tournament because instead of having, a month and a half to get healthy or whatever it might be, you had 2-3 weeks depending on the situation. It was just the unfortunate reality of how this was going to go. It was it was a when, not an if, and a who, not an if. And where did the injuries end up happening? To your backup left back and your fourth choice center back. This is a completely different conversation if guys like Yunus Musa, Tyler Adams, Christian Pulisic aren't on this roster. This is the closest this U.S. men's national team has been to being healthy for basically the entirety of the qualifying cycle. And that is terrific news and a really, really good sign heading into Qatar. Yeah, there are some, Weston McKennie's still working his way back. Matt Turner has a little bit of an issue. Luca De La Torre has a little bit of an issue. But if they're on the roster, that means Greg Berhalter is confident they're going to be able to play at least some kind of role in this tournament. And so all of a sudden, yes, the backup left back thing does scare me. I would have much preferred Sam Vines to Joe Scally. I also expect that in a perfect situation, neither of those guys were going to see the field. Anthony Robinson, Jedi Robinson, was going to play all of the minutes at left back. So, ideally, his backup is not a big deal. And then, center back. It's awful for Chris Richards. Your heart breaks for him. Hopefully he's on the 2026 roster because he's off to a good start in his career and hopefully he just continues to progress and quite frankly was making a real argument he should be on this roster. The good news is he's going to have another opportunity here. His career is just getting started. But if you're going to lose him, being able to bring in a captain of a Premier League team who's playing well is not the worst thing in the world. However you feel about Tim Ream, whatever shortcomings Tim Ream has, they got positions where they have different options that you feel at least okay about. There is no option B for Tyler Adams, for Yunus Musa, for Christian Pulisic. And so it left some guys that have played an important role in qualifying out of the picture because those guys were the replacements for the guys who are healthy and available and headed to Qatar. So that can't get lost in all of this in terms of the who made it, who didn't. To me, the biggest story coming out of this is this is about as close to full strength and as healthy as you could possibly hope to be. And so now we get to see what this group gets to do without all these caveats about, yeah, this guy was missing, this guy was missing. As of right now, this is an incredibly healthy team, and that's a really good sign.